When you're talking about these things, and what have you found? Like, why do we need to eat more meat, and what would the rebuttal be? Because obviously, as you talked about, the study came out where these internal medicine doctors are saying that red meat is not bad for us. So, one, why do we
Mhm.
need to eat more red meat? And then, where do you feel like the whole red meat, probably to use your words, myth came from?
Yeah. I think there's many reasons to eat more red meat. It depends on what you're looking at too. I think just like a high level reason, you it I like to get into satiety, and
Hmm.
I think a lot of people need to lose weight. Let's just put it out there, right? And to
Yeah.
lose weight, I think it's a battle with hunger. And
Hmm.
there's many types of diets. You can make any diet on paper, but does that mean someone's going to stick to it and actually be full? Like I think that's the number one battle people have is like I'm hungry.
Yeah.
And so my high level reason for eating meat is it keeps you full, right? This is the satiety factor. And
Right.
that if you're getting a whole bunch of protein and nutrients that are bioavailable that meat has, you will be full for longer and you can win that battle. And there's all kinds of information and studies on the protein leverage hypothesis that kind of show that all mammals uh, need a certain protein requirement and they eat foods until they get there. So it's
Mm.
really interesting when you look at, they started with like crickets, and they noticed that if they change the feed, the amount of protein to other energy, fat or carbs in the food, they would just eat more of the food if the protein went down to get the same amount of protein. So they
Mm.
would, I don't know if crickets gain weight, but
I don't
they
know.
did it with,
Crickets always look lean to me. I don't
I
know.
know they're
Yeah.
shredded like
Yeah.
nonstop. No, they did with mice, and yeah, the mice would gain weight. It's very
Mm.
obvious that the mice with the lower protein feed gained weight and were less healthy and died sooner, and all this type of stuff. And they try to do it, some of these studies in humans, to show that it also works. It's a little harder to do human studies with all this stuff, but
Right.
yeah, I really think that there's something to do with this protein leverage hypothesis. There's also, I mentioned, bioavailability of nutrients, and so meat has the best bioavailability.
So when you say
Plant-based, I would get
bioavailability, just the amount of nutrients that you're able to absorb. In case anybody's listening, what is that like? Because
exactly, yeah.
the
Like a
absorption
lot
rate.
of, it's like, well, they say, oh, spinach has all this iron, and
Mm-hmm.
well, you're not getting that iron because it's not in the bioavailable form
Mm.
that meat has it in, or protein. There's just easy science. I don't even know why this is debatable. The game changers or all these films, they try to say, oh, there's just as much protein in like the broccoli as there's beef. No, there's not. It's not bioavailable. There's methods. It's the PDCAS or the DIAS. These are two protein digestibility scores and systems that scientists have used, and
Mm-hmm.
it's just not true. It's just meat and eggs. Eggs is kind of like the gold standard.
Right.
You get all of that nutrition and protein and nutrients, and plant foods you don't. So here's a little side story. Like we explain how food works in the film, and I think this is interesting to know why we should eat meat, and it opposes the vegan arguments of why we shouldn't eat meat.
Mm.
So they say, okay, there's grass and there's all these plants, and then herbivores will eat the plant matter, and then carnivores or humans can eat the animals. And they say, why? Let's skip the middleman. Like, this is an inefficient process. Why are we eating the animals when we can just eat the plants straight? And it's an absurd idea. On the top level, you may be able to trick someone into thinking that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these people, these vegan people, maybe they don't think past that, and they're like, yeah, animal rights, but then they don't realize that this is a very valuable service that they provide. These animals eat undigestible food and low quality food and very low protein food that we cannot eat, and they upcycle it into highly bioavailable nutrition
Mm.
that is ideal for human health. So when they're talking about the middleman, I'm saying, yes, this is a very valuable service they're providing. Like, of course we need the middleman. They're eating a whole bunch of grass or spent grains that we use from a distillery, or old corn mash from a ethanol plant, and they're eating this low quality food that's perfectly digestible to them because they have the four stomachs and this whole different digestive process. And so, yes, this is amazing. They actually upcycle. So if you look at how much protein's the most important thing. Like, everyone has too much energy,
Yeah.
right? It's like we're getting carbs and fats everywhere. We just need more protein in our diet. And so if you look at the protein that the cow eats over its lifetime, it actually gives back more protein,
Hmm.
right? It upcycles that so we can get more protein. So that is my answer to the vegans is we need these meat and these animals
Yeah.
to allow us to better get our nutrition.
Okay, so where does the argument of red meat and saturated fat, generally people think red meat, right? They think saturated fat. Where does
Mhm.
that come from then?
Well, many people might know about the Ansel Keys story. I feel like it's like old news to me already. I've heard it a million times, but yeah, there was this guy in 1950s. I mean, if you it happened earlier. Like you could point to Seventh Day Adventists and religious people, and you mentioned Kellogg's, and John Harvey Kellogg has this whole history of with the Seventh Day Adventists, and they have this idea that meat is bad, and they started this a lot earlier. But really, when the science came in, is Eisenhower had a heart attack, and this was also the time when smoking was going crazy. We just started getting all the seed oils, these industrial oils that we were replacing
Hmm.
natural fats with, and so there was a heart disease problem in the 50s. All right, so this was this crisis, and they put together sort of like a commission, the McGovern report. There's different studies that went on before that with Ansel Keys. So there's just a lot of science between these 50s and the 70s that was done that was just bad science, and we covered it all in the film. But basically, the easiest one to explain is the 7 country study, where Ansel Keys went around the world and he looked at like 23 countries, yet he just picked the 7 that fit his little line. And
Hmm.
so he threw out all the things that didn't fit. And then he showed this line where the more saturated fat people ate, the more heart disease they had. And it seems reasonable if you just stop there, right? It's always these easy arguments. And it's like, oh, Japan, like they're healthy and they don't eat a lot of saturated fat. Like, well, that's just they're just eating whole foods. That's just they have access to meat and I mean fish and vegetables and some rice. That's a perfectly good diet.
Yeah.
It just happens to be low in saturated fat. But there's other perfectly good diets that are high in saturated fat that don't cause heart disease at all. And I visited some of these cultures, like in Africa, like the Maasai or
Mm.
the Hadza. I just went to Africa for the film in February, and we spent time with these people and hunted with them and ate with them and all this stuff. And people may know the Inuit, right? They're eating high
Yeah.
fat, high saturated fat, mostly fat. They're fine. Like they don't have heart disease.
Yeah.
So this stuff is easily debunkable. But in the 1950s, when this was done, they didn't do all the science. They didn't have all this information. So it was kind of set into stone in that time with these bad studies. And then kind of the rest is history. Then it opens the door to the food industry. Like if fat is bad, let's
Right.
stuff everything with carbs and sugar and all that, process it, package it. And big business is kind of just supported that narrative ever since, as
Yeah.
they would do, because they're making money and they're trying to protect their profits and bottom line. So of course they just lobby and just continue to push this narrative.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, what's the correlation then? So, when they're looking at when they're looking at the saturated fat, you mentioned seed oils and processed carbohydrates. So, were those people having saturated fat and then having these the seed oils and processed carbohydrates? Was that the driver towards their poor health?
Yeah, I believe so. And I also mentioned smoking too,
Uh huh.
because I think smoking is a big problem with cardiovascular health and heart attacks. And that's been proven out since, right?
Yeah.
And people know to not smoke, but it's very correlated to heart disease. And I mean, causative, I'd say by now we know.
Right.
So, yeah. So, I mean, it wasn't the saturated fat has actually gone down over the years. So, saturated fat is something that humans have always eaten. People, you could say, oh, my great grandparents, they were healthy and they would just eat steak and potatoes. I'm like, yes, it's a great diet. Eat steak and potatoes. That's people for all of history were eating saturated fat. And so really the problems come in when they start adding in, the seed oils. And yes, you could either say that if you're adding all of the processed carbs and sugars on top of saturated fat and having the seed oils on top of saturated fat,
Yeah.
yes, that is bad. Now we're just like having way too much fat. Well, any energy is fat or carbs. We
Right.
any amount of too much energy of any kind can be bad, right? That's how people develop type 2 diabetes and insulin
Mm.
resistance and all these problems. So yes, you're right. So the saturated fat was never the problem, right? It's just you're adding in all these other processed foods on top.